My husband had only been gone for 3 minutes, just long enough to take a call outside the restaurant, when the woman at the table beside me leaned over and pressed a folded napkin into my hand. I almost didn't take it. I thought she'd mistaken me for someone else. She was maybe 75, white hair pulled back neatly, wearing a coral cardigan that had been washed too many times. She didn't look alarming. She looked like someone's grandmother. But her eyes were absolutely serious. "Don't read it now," she said quietly, "and don't tell him I gave you anything." Then she turned back to her soup like nothing had happened. I sat there holding a folded napkin under the table, my heart doing something strange and fast, and I watched my husband through the glass window of the restaurant. He was pacing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear, laughing about something. He looked completely relaxed. He always looked completely relaxed. His name was Douglas. We'd been married for 11 years. I'd met him when I was 52, which everyone around me seemed to think was some kind of miracle, a second chance at something I'd given up on. My first marriage had ended in my 40s, quietly and without much drama. Just two people who'd grown into entirely different shapes. My daughter Alicia had been 18 by then, already halfway out the door herself, and she'd taken it better than I expected. When I met Douglas at a mutual friend's retirement dinner in Ottawa, I thought, finally, someone who matched my pace. He was funny in the dry way I liked, well-read, and he had this habit of listening to me with his full face, like what I was saying actually mattered. I fell for that. I fell for it completely. We married 2 years later. I sold my condo in the Glebe and moved into his house in Westboro. I left the interior design firm I'd built over 20 years and poured the sale proceeds into a joint account he'd suggested we open for our future. At 63, I thought I was building something. I thought I was safe. I should tell you, I am not a naive woman. I have a business degree. I ran my own company for 2 decades. I have a daughter I raised largely alone, and I put her through university, and I did all of it while keeping my accounts balanced and my contracts tight. I say this not to brag, but because I need you to understand how deeply someone can be deceived when they've decided to trust. When you choose to believe in a person, you stop reading the fine print. That is the oldest trap in the world, and I walked into it with my eyes wide open and full of love. The first sign was the visa. About 8 months into the marriage, I went to use my personal credit card at a Loblaws, just groceries, nothing remarkable, and it was declined. I stood there at the checkout with a cart full of food, feeling the particular humiliation of that moment, the cashier looking at me with patient blankness, the person behind me shifting their weight. I apologized, paid with a different card, and called the bank from the parking lot. The account had been closed. Not suspended, closed. And the woman on the phone told me very gently that the primary account holder had requested the closure 3 weeks earlier. Douglas was the primary account holder. I hadn't noticed that when we signed the paperwork. I'd been busy. I'd been happy. I'd been 63 years old and in love, and I had not read the fine print. When I brought it up at home, Douglas barely looked up from his laptop. "I was consolidating things," he said. "It was a redundant account. I'll add you to the main one this week." He said it the way you'd say, "I'll pick up milk." Mild, reasonable. And he did add me to the main account, technically, but I couldn't make changes to it without his secondary authorization. A little detail he mentioned so casually I nearly missed it. "Just a security feature," he said. "The bank recommends it for joint accounts." I told myself it was fine. Then my daughter called me in February and she said something that cracked something open in me. "Mom," she said, "do you know Douglas called me last month?" I didn't. "He asked me a lot of questions about your mental health, about whether you'd ever had anxiety issues or memory problems. He mentioned you'd been forgetting things." I sat very still in the kitchen of the house that had his name on the deed. "I haven't been forgetting things," I said. "I know," she said. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I went back through the past months in my mind, the way you go back through a document looking for errors, methodically, without wanting to find them, and I found them. Little moments I'd dismissed. The time he'd told his brother, in front of me, that I'd gotten confused about our dinner reservation. I hadn't been confused. The restaurant had moved the booking without telling us. The way he'd started gently correcting me in conversation. That's not quite what happened, love. Always gentle. Always with a small smile that made me feel like I was being protected rather than managed. I hadn't said anything because I'd told myself I was being paranoid, but I wasn't paranoid. I know that now. I knew at the moment my daughter said his name and the word mental health in the same breath. That dinner at the restaurant, it was a Thursday in late April, one of those Ottawa evenings that can't quite decide if it's still winter. Douglas had suggested we go somewhere nice. He'd been particularly warm all week, attentive in the way he sometimes was, before he needed something from me. We went to a place he liked in Hintonburg, small and candlelit and expensive. Halfway through the appetizers, his phone rang. He glanced at it, said, "Sorry, love, I have to take this," and walked outside. And the woman in the coral cardigan slid a folded napkin across the space between our tables. I waited until Douglas was still visible through the glass, still pacing, still laughing, and then I unfolded it under the table and read it with my eyes angled down. Your husband is having your power of attorney transferred without your knowledge. He has a meeting with a notary on Friday at 2 p.m. The address is on the back. My name is Iris. I worked for his first wife. Please be careful. I folded it back up. I put it in the pocket of my blazer. When I looked up, the woman, Iris, was paying her bill. She didn't look at me again. Douglas came back to the table 2 minutes later, sat down, picked up his fork and said, "Sorry about that. Now, where were we?" I smiled. I said, "You were about to tell me about the Gatineau trip." And I sat across from my husband of 11 years and ate my dinner and made conversation, and the whole time I was thinking, Friday. He has a meeting on Friday. It was Wednesday night. I need to explain what a power of attorney means in this context because it matters. In Canada, a continuing power of attorney for property gives someone the legal authority to manage all of your financial affairs, your accounts, your assets, your investments. Even if you're mentally capable of doing so yourself, it's meant to be a protection for people who become incapacitated. In the wrong hands, it's something else entirely. I had signed a POA 2 years earlier at Douglas's suggestion when his mother had been ill and he'd been thinking about end-of-life planning. We both signed ones for each other, he said, in case anything happened. I'd signed it because I loved him and because he'd made it feel like something responsible adults in a committed relationship simply did. What I didn't know was whether what I'd signed had since been altered, whether the notary meeting on Friday was the first step or the final one. I didn't sleep that night. I lay beside Douglas in the dark and listened to him breathe, and I thought about Iris, the coral cardigan, the careful eyes, the fact that she had worked for his first wife. I hadn't known much about Douglas's first wife, a woman named Brenda who died 6 years before I met him. He didn't talk about her much. He'd said it was still painful. I had respected that. I had not asked questions. I was asking them now. Inside my own skull, at 3 a.m. In the morning, I told Douglas I was meeting a friend for coffee, and I drove instead to a payphone. Yes, they still exist. There's one outside a Shoppers Drug Mart on Richmond Road. And I called Alicia. I told her everything. I told her about the napkin, about the POA, about the phone call she'd received. I heard her breath change as I spoke. "Mom," she said when I finished, "you need a lawyer today, not tomorrow. Today." I had a friend from my design firm days, a woman I'd known for 30 years, someone I trusted completely, and her son-in-law was an estates lawyer. I called her from the same payphone. She gave me his number without asking why. That is what a real friend does. His name was Oliver. He had an office near the Rado Centre, and he saw me at noon that same day. I sat across from him and I put the napkin on his desk and I told him everything I've just told you. And when I was done, he looked at me very steadily and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." He explained that if Douglas was attempting to modify or activate a POA without my knowledge, there were serious legal issues at play. He made calls while I sat in his waiting room drinking terrible coffee. By 2 o'clock, he'd spoken to 2 colleagues and confirmed what I'd feared. There was paperwork in process. A meeting was indeed scheduled for Friday, and the POA document that had been submitted for revision was not the one I remembered signing. "It's been altered," Oliver said simply. "The scope has been expanded significantly." I had a very specific feeling in that moment, not panic, something colder, the feeling of understanding something that had been true for a long time that you simply hadn't been able to see. I called Alicia from Oliver's office. She drove straight there from Canetta. She walked into the office still in her work clothes, sat down beside me and took my hand, and I had to look at the ceiling for a moment because I am not a woman who cries easily, and I was coming very close. Oliver moved quickly. He filed what needed to be filed that afternoon to freeze any changes to my accounts and flag the POA documentation with the Law Society. He also connected me, through a colleague, with a woman named Barbara, a recently retired RCMP officer who now worked in financial fraud investigation. She agreed to meet me the next morning. That night I went home to Douglas. I made dinner. I asked him about his day. I was very calm. I have run a business. I know how to be calm when everything in me wants to run. He asked if I was all right. I said I had a headache. He made sympathetic sounds and went to watch television, and I sat in the bathroom for 20 minutes with the door locked, just breathing. Barbara met me at a Tim Hortons on Thursday morning. She was early, already had 2 coffees waiting, and she had a directness about her that I found deeply comforting. She'd seen variations of what I was describing, more times than she could count, she said. Older women, second marriages, assets consolidated during the relationship, POA activated or manipulated once the groundwork was laid. "It's a pattern," she said, not unkindly. "You're not the first, and we need to make sure you're not the last one he does this to." She said that word, he, with a particular weight that told me she'd already done some digging. His first wife, Brenda, had died of a stroke. That part was true, but in the 2 years before her death, almost everything she owned had been transferred into his name, her RRSP, her rental property in Kingston, the joint investments they'd held for decades. It had all been legal. That was the terrible part. All of it technically legal, because she had trusted him and because he had been very patient. I sat with that information for a long time. Barbara had also found Iris, the woman in the coral cardigan. Her full name was Iris Whitfield. She had been Brenda's closest friend for 40 years and had watched the last 2 years of Brenda's life with a grief and a fury she had never been able to do anything with. When she'd heard Douglas had remarried, she'd hired a paralegal to monitor any legal filings connected to his name. When the POA modification came through, she'd had Douglas and his wife, me, located. She'd been watching for an opening to reach me for 6 weeks. She'd chosen the restaurant because Douglas had made a reservation there every second Thursday for years. She'd simply waited. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A woman I'd never met had spent 6 weeks trying to find a way to protect me from a man she'd watched destroy her best friend. She had done it quietly, with her own money, out of nothing but love for someone who was already gone and determination that it would not happen again. When Barbara told me Iris wanted to meet me, I said yes immediately. We met on a Friday morning, just the 2 of us, at a cafe near the Bywood Market. She was already there when I arrived, the same coral cardigan. She stood up when she saw me. I don't know what I expected to feel. I reached out to shake her hand, and she took it in both of hers, and she said, "I'm so sorry I couldn't get to you sooner." I had to look at the ceiling again. She told me about Brenda, not the legal facts, which I already knew, but the human ones, the way Brenda had laughed, The way she'd been a school librarian for 31 years and kept every card her students had ever given her in a shoebox. The way she'd started forgetting small things in her final years, and how Douglas had been so attentive, so concerned, and how Iris had not understood until it was too late that the attentiveness had a purpose. She trusted him, Iris said. That was her only mistake. The irony is that Douglas had scheduled the notary meeting for Friday afternoon, the same afternoon that Oliver and Barbara and 2 investigators from the Ontario Securities Commission were meeting with a Crown attorney in the building 6 blocks away. I did not go to the notary's office. Douglas went. He sat down across from the notary, a man named Gerald who had been retained without full knowledge of the situation, and before the meeting could begin, 2 things happened in sequence. First, Oliver served Douglas with papers formally contesting the POA modification and flagging the expanded document as fraudulently prepared. Second, Barbara arrived with a colleague and asked Douglas some questions he had not prepared answers for. It wasn't a dramatic arrest. Those mostly aren't in real life. It was a great deal of paperwork and a great deal of very careful legal language, and Douglas sitting in a chair looking at the table with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, an expression of recalibration, of someone realizing the board had been flipped. Alicia drove me home that afternoon. We didn't talk much. She made tea. We sat in the kitchen of what was technically still his house, but no longer, in any meaningful way, his. And I held the mug with both hands and felt something I hadn't felt in months, like my own life was mine again. The legal process took time, the way legal processes always do. There were hearings, there were financial disclosures that made my estate's lawyer's jaw tighten in a way that was almost satisfying to watch. In the end, the modified POA was declared void. The consolidated joint accounts were audited. A significant portion of what Douglas had been quietly moving was traced and frozen. I won't tell you the exact numbers because they don't matter as much as the principle, but I will tell you that my accountant, a brisk woman who takes nothing personally, told me I'd gotten out before the worst of it and that I was, in her exact words, financially intact, if bruised. Douglas was charged with fraud. The proceedings are still ongoing as I write this. His lawyer is very expensive, and the wheels of justice turn the way they always do, slowly and with a great deal of friction. But they are turning. The house went to me in the separation, not because I wanted it. I've since sold it. I couldn't live there. But because my lawyer was thorough. I bought a small unit in a co-op building near the canal. Alicia helped me move. She carried boxes and complained about the elevator and ordered Thai food, and we sat on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by my own things, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely like myself. I've spoken with Iris several times since all of this. She came to my new place for tea in August, and I showed her the canal view from my balcony, and she stood there with both hands wrapped around her mug, looking out at the water, and she said, "Brenda would have liked this." I didn't know what to say, so I just said, "Thank you for being at that restaurant." She turned and looked at me, and for a moment she looked very tired and very old, and also completely at peace. "I've been waiting a long time to be useful," she said. "I think about that often, the way some acts of courage don't look like courage from the outside. They look like a woman in a coral cardigan eating soup alone at a restaurant, waiting for the right moment, pressing a folded napkin into a stranger's hand. I am 64 years old. I have a good lawyer, a daughter who answers on the second ring, a new apartment that is entirely mine, and a friend I never expected to make. I also have a piece of advice, and I give it with all the love I have to every woman reading this. Before you consolidate anything, your money, your accounts, your legal documents, with anyone, no matter how much you trust them, read every word. Have your own lawyer read it too. Not because love isn't real. Love can be real, and the fine print can still betray you. And if a stranger ever presses something into your hand and says, "Don't read it now, listen to her," I still think about that napkin, how small it was, how much was folded inside it. The thing about Douglas, and I've had a lot of time to think about this, is that he wasn't stupid. He was patient. And patience, when it's pointed in the wrong direction, can do enormous damage over a very long time. He counted on the fact that I was a reasonable woman, that I would give him the benefit of the doubt, that love, once extended, resists being taken back. He understood something about human nature that I hadn't fully reckoned with, that the people most likely to trust you are the ones who've already decided you're good. What I understand now is that the outcome of this story wasn't luck. It was the result of choices, his, mine, and Iris's, stacking up over years until they fell the only way they could. Douglas made choices that were calculated and dishonest. Every small manipulation, every gently corrected sentence, every financial account quietly reshaped. Those were decisions, not accidents. And the thing about that kind of behavior is that it requires a certain contempt for the other person. You cannot deceive someone you genuinely respect. You cannot gaslight someone you see as your equal. His choices revealed his character far more clearly than anything he ever said to me. But Iris made choices too. She could have done nothing. She had no obligation to me. We'd never met. We'd never spoken. She had already lost her closest friend, and she had every reason to be exhausted by the whole thing. Instead, she spent 6 weeks and her own money making sure I would have a fighting chance. That is not a small thing. That is someone who understood that doing right by others, even strangers, even when it costs you, is not optional. It's just what decent people do. And I made choices. I am not entirely without responsibility in this story. I chose not to read the fine print. I chose to let love make me incurious. There is no shame in that. It is a very human thing to do, but it is something I can own. The moment I stopped making excuses and started paying attention, things moved quickly, because I also chose to trust my daughter when she told me something was wrong. I chose to walk into Oliver's office and tell the truth. I chose to sit across from Douglas at dinner and smile and say nothing and wait when everything in me wanted to overturn the table. That last one took something I hadn't known I still had. I'd spent so many months being made to feel smaller, less capable, unreliable. And then in one evening, I had to be steady and clear-eyed and completely unreadable. I surprised myself. I think we often do when the moment finally comes. What this taught me, what I'd tell anyone who asked, is that your intelligence is not just what you know, it's what you're willing to question, including the things you most want to believe. Your integrity is not just being honest yourself. It's being willing to act when you see dishonesty happening to someone else, the way Iris did. And the will to keep going, to not fall apart when the floor drops out. That doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from every hard thing you've already survived. I'm 64. I have a canal view and a daughter who answers on the second ring. That is enough. That is more than enough.